with this technology issue that we're having. I've already hit record, everyone's on mute, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and turn everything over to Mr. Ritter. So we'll have enough time to cover everything.
Yeah, thanks. Apologies, you all. I don't know whether my computer is rebelling. We have a plan B about how we're showing this. I've been doing a lot of presentations, several in a row for the UNC system staff. So I don't know if it's tired or telling me enough PowerPoint or what. So hopefully we'll sail through this and we should have plenty of time. If not, you can always ask questions. But we're talking about campus responsibilities. This is appearing right. Everybody can see it on your screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to talk about is the new campus residency responsibility guide. One of the things I want to distinguish is this may be very helpful of what's the role of RDS versus the campus and why RDS sometimes handles certain exceptions but not others. The campus also has some role in not only those campus-based exceptions, but tracking a few students. And I want to give plenty of time to handle questions and answers. So a new campus responsibility guide was issued last month, and I really expanded this and tried to make it more user-friendly and practical for a campus. So at the beginning of it, you'll find everyone's contact information, all the websites, all the phone numbers, all the emails, and so forth, as well as tools in the back of, what are the category codes and exception codes, which we'll go through what they are. So hopefully I've expanded it, and then for some of the campus-based exceptions that apply to community college, we're going to talk about. There was a lot of discussion about, and some of them requiring someone was a lawfully admitted non-citizen, and we'll talk about it. I gave you examples about what documentation would be involved in that. So as an overview of what the manual contains, again, it talks about the roles, and then what tuition exceptions are handled by RDS and which ones are handled by the campus, getting into specific exceptions, and then additional provisions or tracking responsibilities, how to handle tuition waivers, and then there's some summary charts in there for you. So first, in talking about roles, it's RDS's role to provide all residency determinations. So in other words, do you meet or does the student meet the regular requirements to be considered a resident that are in statute, okay? The exceptions we talk about are exceptions pertaining to tuition. It doesn't change your residency. And that's an important distinction because the laws pertaining to state grants require, in most cases, you have to be a resident and meet the residency criteria. So someone eligible for a waiver would be okay at tuition, but not grants. Another thing that RDS does is it screens for eligible immigration status. If they say they're a non-citizen, RDS collects the documentation, reviews it, and determines if they have an eligible status. And we'll talk later about tracking, but if they have a permanent status, there's no need for the campus to worry about that. If they're what they call the green card holder, the lawful permanent resident, it's permanent. It's like a US citizen, it's permanent. If they have a temporary status like a visa, then we pass on a flag because those have to be tracked because their eligibility is only as good as long as they have an eligible visa. So RDS also reviews, there's a lot of provisions, if you look at the guidebook, about special situations pertaining to residency. And again, because it's not a tuition exception, we look at that. Are they a ward of the state? Have they been orphaned? For all of these things, there are special provisions. If the student indicates or gives us information that they're not meeting criteria, RDS tries to screen for this if they give us enough information. What happens, like if one parent lives in one state and one on the other, split families. So RDS will screen for all those because that's part of the residency determination. Okay. So RDS will handle those types of issues as well. There are two specific statutory tuition exceptions that RDS will handle. And the reason is they don't require something like, for example, the veterans exception, requires that they have to, in that term, have and use a benefit. Once it's used up, it's used up. There's no way RDS will know that in terms of a future enrollment. But for these categories, the active duty military station here and North Carolina National Guard, they don't have to use a benefit, an educational benefit like the veterans do. And you've got to look at something long term, but basically there's no other conditions to it. So RDS screens for that up front. And by the way, it's not all members of the National Guard. In both of these cases, we first try to see, do they meet the regular criteria for residency? If they do, then there's no need to track it. They would get the NN. It could qualify them for a grant. That's in the student's best interest. It's if they don't meet that. They're claiming another state as their permanent home, but they're here on active duty, or a National Guard member that just moved here. In those cases, they could qualify for an exception for tuition, but not for residency. Okay. Sorry. So anything that RDS determines like that, RDS collects and validates that documentation. Okay. If it's something you need to track, and we'll get to that later, RDS will let you know and flag it. There aren't that many situations where that happens. So for example, the student is a lawful permanent resident, a green card holder, we collect it. The expiration date in the card doesn't make any difference because it's a permanent, lifelong. In fact, the old cards had no expiration, they were good for life. They just do that to try to combat fraud. But once we verify that with immigration, they're good to go like a US citizen is. There's no need to track that because it is a permanent status. So RDS collects all that information up front. So I guess you could choose to collect a lot of the information RDS does, but that was part of it. And by the way, RDS, for the most part, things are done electronically as much as possible. We have gradually through the years eliminated requesting documents from most students. If they go to an appeal and have special circumstance or think the databases are wrong, we'll certainly take a document. But with few exceptions, I mean, it's basically military station here, immigration issues, and if it's something like, for example, a court involvement saying, oh, I have a court-appointed guardian, or I was legally emancipated by a court, in those cases, RDS would, but almost, that's about it. I mean, there are very few cases anymore that require documentation. We verify with the databases in the state online. So let's talk about then the role of the campus. So the campus would review eligibility for any campus-based tuition exceptions. Again, it will never change residency, but it's tuition. Tracking students have a time-limited eligibility. So many of those campus-based exceptions, for example, might be good for 1 year, or some of them specify it has to be right after they graduated high school. Within 1 year, they have a window. So the campus would be responsible for those, and we'll go through those. RDS will flag a record that needs tracking, and really it would just be in 3 categories. If it's a time-limited visa or temporary protected status, active duty military long-term, because they can keep that as long as they're enrolled in the same program, and National Guard members who are non-resident. There are very few. I did a query last year, and I think we had something like 16 ever since RDS went live, which we're approaching like 1.8 million determinations and about 1.5 million unique students since we went live. Keep in mind, this is also for UNCs and out-of-state people coming here and so forth. So that would only be the National Guard who, we have a handful, for example, live in South Carolina near Charlotte. There's a large Air National Guard unit there, and they want to affiliate there. So they would be eligible for that, basically out in, as long as they're still active in the Guard. Those are usually long-term contracts, so you'll see a tracking date sometimes 6 years out. But if it's something that you need to see they're still eligible, there'll be a flag passed on with a tracking date. Statutory grace period, we're going to talk about that in coordinating. There's some provisions that they're for attending. If they're attending and they have left the state in terms of a permanent residence and maybe want to stay enrolled in distance learning, there are provisions that they can do that for a period of time. And then any tuition exceptions that you grant at the campus level, that's when you need to collect documentation. So it's, if RDS, in general, if RDS is making the determination, you don't have to worry about the documentation from a tuition billing perspective. But if you're making a campus-based exception because they did not meet residency criteria and you're going to waive tuition, you want to collect information. And the guidebook goes through each, the campus guide goes through each type of campus exception and what documentation to look for. So, you know, if there's an audit, you want to show, here's why we gave that student an exception for in-state tuition when they didn't meet residency criteria. Okay. So let me talk about campus-based exceptions. And there are, and again, as I mentioned, there are several specific ones, but they have to be handled at the campus because of specific eligibility requirements. For example, the UNC system has one that can be used at a community college for a UNC permanent full-time employee and their household. It has certain requirements to it, but it's contingent on every semester continued employment. So that's not something you give once and then the person could use it for 5 years and that person may have left employment. So some of them specifically dictate a time frame or a reevaluation. So, and again, in all of these, we wouldn't change the residency status, but in effect, it's kind of like RDS giving that out into the active duty military. If you certify eligibility and have the documentation to support it, they're a non-resident, so wouldn't be eligible for a state grant, but they could for the in-state tuition. So there are a couple of exceptions that can be applied at any college or university, and those are the veterans and the statutory grace period. I'm going to come back to the statutory grace period a little bit later. Other exceptions are specific in law to either UNC system or the community college system, okay, and can't be transferred between them. So let me start with the veterans because that's pretty common for you all, and I get some questions about it, is the veterans exceptions when needed. And all of these exceptions are, to me, when needed. If the student can pass the regular residency criteria, it's in their best interest and probably yours to have them do that, that they have that in, you won't have to track, but also it would open the door for eligibility for state grants. Okay. Veterans exceptions kind of a little bit unique here, but it requires that they have been awarded and use a military educational benefit. Talk a little bit about that. I had a call from a university not long ago. They had a new staff member that just went ahead and gave everybody an exemption. They found out half of them didn't have a benefit. It's governed by federal law. So it's referenced in North Carolina statutes, but basically it's federal law that governs eligibility, primarily the Veterans Choice Act. So veteran, eligible spouse, or dependent may use this, okay? And eligibility here means they were assigned a benefit if it's a spouse or dependent, have it, it's awarded, they're using it. So this exception in some ways is easier because it's always triggered by an award, okay? They didn't get awarded, they didn't have a benefit assigned to them, they've used up their benefits, that's it. And those are the conditions laid out in federal law. Again, this is something the federal government takes charge of in terms of eligibility. If someone does not have or does not want to use a benefit, they're not eligible for a waiver. And the idea was to help, because military moves so frequently, especially someone recently discharged, that they can help them as they're establishing a new home after they've been discharged. We've had a couple people two of them very high up in the military system, but we had a couple try to challenge that. But I mean, basically, that's federal law and not ours, and one went to the governor and so forth. But they had a benefit, didn't want to use it. They wanted to save it for later. There's a finite pot of money, and they can even use it for graduate school if they still have a benefit. But it's required, you know, for using a benefit. So that's key. The exception has to be returned. It's only valid in a term when they use an award. Even if they have a partial award, if they're using it, you know, up and that's what's left, they're eligible for a waiver. Until recently, there was a 3-year window post-discharge in federal law. That time frame was lifted August 1st of this year. So basically, if they have a benefit and the VA says they have it, they're good to go. Again, they can come back at any time if they've been there a couple of years and try to qualify for the NN through RDS. If they have duration now and they didn't, you know, just move here and made changes. On this one, the VA has very specific record keeping requirements. And so that's what I would suggest the campus follow in terms of the record keeping of the award was given, you have it on file, and they have to be tracked that it's only in those periods. So if a student's benefits are used up this semester, they can't continue indefinitely with this exception. Statutory grace period we'll talk about cannot be applied here because it really is not a residency determination. It's an exception. In general, it isn't. And we'll talk about that where students have a change in circumstance and we're trying to give them some time in the meantime to get things in order. So that's one of the more common ones. The big thing to remember about that is, again, it hinges on the award. So now I'm going to talk about some of the campus-based exceptions that are carved into law for community colleges. And you may be familiar with some of these. Getting a lot of questions about the high school ones because, you know, there's been some recent discussion and changes. I'll try to spend a little time on that. Again, the campus guide goes into great detail for each one of these and what would be necessary. These provisions are not in the general residency law that we use. It's separate to community college, talking about attendance and tuition and fees and so forth. So these are ones that were sought by the community college system. As I say, UNC has a couple. These are the community college system. So some of these you're probably familiar with, but in a quick nutshell, the business sponsored is when you have a North Carolina business that is sponsoring a student, sending them in, and they are paying the full amount of that student's tuition and fees directly, then an exception can be given. So campus needs to collect documentation that's the case. I know some campuses have, and a lot of these things fall to campus-based workflows. You need to look at your campus. Some campuses have an actual form the employer has to fill out and return to someone, the business office or whomever. But you need to track these students because it's good only as long as that business is paying. So if that student, you know, the business paid it for one semester, they are not eligible to keep this exception, let's say, for another year or two. Okay. And by the way, this is probably, well, there's two scenarios. I know of only two. This is one of two that a student, for example, could be in DACA status or not have an eligible status and could qualify. Most of the rest of them are very specifically excluding that. So this is one of two exceptions that it's possible if they're paying the entire bill directly. Basically, it's the employer that is seen as, you know, the North Carolina employer is footing the bill for someone to get trained. Business and military transferred families. This is the one that I think you know, there's a cap set that it can't exceed 1% of your out-of-state, your non-resident students. So very limited. I would suggest that if you, so the idea is someone's employer transferred them from one state to another where they have a presence in North Carolina. For military transferred, if they're really active duty military, I would suggest you send them to RDS to get that OI and find out why they didn't qualify, because then you won't have to count it against that 1%, and then you don't have to worry about it every semester, about continued eligibility. These are seen as time limited. The idea is they have to be here in North Carolina and that they're establishing residency. A lot of these exceptions have that in its spirit of, we're trying to help someone who just got here, but it's not meant to be a long-term situation. Okay. Students by nonprofit, I don't know that you have very many of those, but that's lined out. And again, they have to be residing in North Carolina. Okay. And that's their primary residence. I want to talk about the next one in particular. This has come up for discussion on the last few liaison calls, certain non-US citizen public high school graduates. So we're getting a lot of questions, especially about the next one we're going to get to that was just passed in law about, well, this student graduated high school, but RDS put them out, okay? So in any of these exceptions, the student must still meet RDS criteria to be a resident. The question is, if they're eligible for tuition exception, you could waive it. So RDS is not going to tell you they're in. RDS is not going to do that, nor if they flag in there, the student says they're in high school graduate, does it automatically trigger? You have to verify. Those codes passed on as based on a student report. For example, the one of UNC employees. A lot of students at UNC campuses try to say, oh, I'm an employee, I get an exception. Well, no, they're here from out of state going to school and they're working 10 hours a week. That's not a regular full-time employee. If they say they are, we pass on the informational flag to the campus, but you're responsible for verifying. So this is the one that requires that, when I say certain non-citizens, is the person had to have been lawfully admitted. And I've given you in the new guidebook several forms. You could look for one of those to see what that was. So basically, this is a student who at some point, it may not be current, has a visa or had a visa, came here, and sometimes is what immigration calls an overstay. You had a visitor visa for 3 months and you have stayed beyond that, but you were lawfully admitted. Okay, who wouldn't be covered is someone who has DACA status generally, or someone who is applying for asylum but has never had that lawful admission visa. They're not eligible according to the way the statute was worded in North Carolina community college rules there. Okay, so I've given you several suggestions for that about how to monitor that. What forms to look for, but that's what we mean about certain, they had to have been lawfully admitted. So again, your DACA students are not covered, your people applying for asylum. The student must, from RDS perspective, in terms of legal capacity, have an eligible status currently and have had some status for 12 months. So applying for a status and not having one is not having one currently. You can, and they'll say, well, I can work, I can stay, yes, but immigration classifies them as not having any immigration status other than a under review kind of thing. The one for refugees. Refugees is certainly an eligible category that RDS would give in state to. This is meant to help someone who just got here, okay? So hasn't met the duration. So yes, so in theory, that should just be for like a year. But refugees, so if someone just arrived and they're trying to take classes, you can give them this exception as long as they're living in North Carolina and show you an eligible status. So we just had a question about related to this last one about the applying for asylum and a past legal entry. So unfortunately, people applying for asylum have a long wait these days. It can take years to get an answer, okay? Anyone who, yes, Heidi, anyone who had in the past a lawful admission, or as immigration calls it also a entry with inspection versus without inspection, should qualify. So if they had, and it doesn't have to be a visa that we consider eligible. So, for example, F1 visa or a tourist visa are not considered eligible for establishing permanent residence, but they were lawfully admitted. So the way this exception is worded, they would qualify as long as they had one in the past. Most of them probably don't, but some would. Okay, hope that helps. So refugees, as I say, I mean, after a year, you can send them back and hopefully they'll meet the requirements. They've been here a year. Okay, so a non-citizen of the U.S. seeking immigrant status. There's some misunderstanding about this one. Someone has applied for a green card, which involves at least two different forms. Someone off the street just can't apply for a green card. There are only certain paths into it, and with few exceptions, you had to have already had some status. Okay, you had to have had a visa. You had to have something. There has to be a path. There are rare exceptions where you have someone who's recently married and they're trying to bring over, family that has married, them or something like that, where maybe they didn't and they'll give it to them, but it's not common. So these are people that are applying. Depending on their path, some of them go very quickly. Like if they've married a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, they tend to go quickly. Others do not. There's a small category that has a cap on a diversity visa from certain countries that are underrepresented, and they only give a finite number per year, and probably only about 10 to 20% make it. So it's not guaranteed, but usually those goes fairly quickly. RDS will take that paperwork if it shows they've been approved, because then there's a big delay in them getting the physical green card because of all this biometric stuff now. But this is given exception who's someone who has filed but not been approved. So again, I detailed what are the documents that you could use to determine that in there. And there's been recent change I made in the guidebook to add another eligible document. Let's see, we have another question here about undocumented students who are undocumented by overstaying. Okay, first of all, there's a common misuse of the term undocumented, which is not the same way immigration uses it. So if a student had a visa, okay, and it expired, they're not undocumented per se. I mean, that gets a little gray, but let's say the person who's applied for asylum or a DACA student, they're not undocumented. They have a document from immigration. They have permission to work. They'll even get a social security number. But they don't have an eligible status. It's kind of a temporary until a decision is made. So yes, once they were admitted, even if it's an overstay or they don't have something currently, yes, Heidi, they would be eligible. If they never had one, that's where there's an issue. But they can show you that at some point they were admitted. Yeah, I mean, so undocumented meaning they haven't applied for anything since, yes, but they still have documentation of legal entry. They're an overstay. Again, it gets to a technicality, but in other words, they don't have documentation of a current status, but they do have some immigration documents to share. Immigration knows they're here is probably a good way to phrase that. Okay, then we have law enforcement officers. You probably don't see that very often. If they're here, they're stationed here, they're getting training, there's provisions for that. This next one is the new one that was just signed into law for kind of paralleling the other high school exception for certain non-citizens. This is certain U.S. citizens, public high school grads. And when I put out a new revision of the guidebook, I'll put more detail in because I put something in there, it was still pending governor's signature, it's been signed into law. And basically this allows that a student who, I think the statute says, was unable to provide sufficient documentation to RDS, it gives them a 1-year kind of pass, if you will, right after high school graduation. So if they graduate in the spring, that next academic year, they can have 1 year of an adjusted in-state tuition if they graduated a North Carolina public high school. After that, they're going to have to qualify another way or lose their eligibility. It's, that was a recent exception sought by the system office to try to help students in that 1 year, in that period after. But at the end of that year, they've got to find a way to qualify or they lose eligibility, because the statute is very specific about it's for that year only. So someone who graduated 3 years ago, it's not going to help them. Okay. I should have put UNC employees. This next one is that eligible full-time UNC employees and their families. And there's guidance in there what to do. It's not just, I'm telling you that's the case. UNC system in its statute requires they have to get something from the HR, at the campus, the workers at certifying it's a permanent regular position and they're eligible. Again, it doesn't apply to graduate assistants, anyone temporary, anyone that's part-time. So, and that again is limited by statute for each term they're attending to make sure they're still eligible. So those are the campus-based exceptions, and they say each one in the new guide, I can go through, it will go through details of what you need to collect or whether it needs to be tracked or how long it's good for. So anytime, again, you are making a campus-based exception, you need to collect the documentation to support why you're giving the exception, how they meet it when RDS said they didn't meet the general criteria. And then if it needs tracking, okay, you've got to track that. So that student that's only good for 1 year, by the way, that new high school exception, there's forthcoming from the system office a new student type to use in that to distinguish between that one and the one for non-citizens. So you want to do that, and you probably want to follow your process for end dating it so that it's not there for the next 10 years, because the law says they have 1 year to use it. If you have a student who has any of these exceptions, again, especially after a year, you might want to encourage them to come back to RDS, because if they at that point meet the regular criteria, you won't have to worry about exceptions, won't have to worry about tracking. And again, it's in their best interest because it opens up the possibility of state grant eligibility. Okay. So that's kind of it with exceptions. So the question came up about, and this is really more grants, but I'll tell you what I know from Jeremy at Cape Fear about one of those exceptions, like the certain U.S. citizen high school, public high school graduate exception, still get access to the long leave grant? I believe the answer is no. That's been looked at. Again, in general, there's a separate set of laws that govern state financial aid and grants, and almost universally they have to meet the regular requirements for. I mean, if there's any question, you could try and seek guidance from Tracy Mitchell and grants, but that's my understanding because that question has come up a couple times recently. In general, there's a couple of exceptions for. Well, actually, it doesn't even apply to a community college for some veterans and active duty, but you have to be a regular resident and not qualify. Monty, did you have something?
Right.
Yeah.
I think the long leave grant falls under the same guidelines as the community college grant and the lottery. So you have to be a U.S. Yeah, you have to be a North Carolina resident.
Yeah. In general, that's what the statute's talking about grants address. You have to be a North Carolina resident. And not, we're giving you an exception because you don't meet the criteria to be a resident. Okay. So talk about that. We'll talk about. Well, let me pause for a second before we go on to this. We've been talking about campus-based exceptions. There are some things campuses have to track, and I'm going to go on and talk about that, and then try to push through and give time here for questions. So anytime you have a campus-based tuition exception, you need to track any time limited. So for example, that high school we mentioned, it's only good for 1 year after their high school graduation. So you're going to need to track those students and make sure you code them that at the end of that year, they need to come back to RDS or they're going to revert to an out-of-state determination. Okay. RDS has very limited scenarios where we will pass on a tracking issue and a flag to a campus. And primarily it's time-limited immigration status. That's only two categories, a visa or what we call temporary protected status. Those are finite time periods which may or may not be renewed. For example, the most common visa we see is what we call an H-1B for skilled workers. The parent might have, a dependent might have an H-4, but there are age limits to keeping that H-4, just as H-1B, there's limits about employment if employment ceases and no one else picks them up, but there are age limits to H-4, or once they marry, they lose eligibility. So there's no guarantee. And we'll hear from students, oh, I've applied for an extension, but I haven't heard back yet. Well, they're out of compliance. So there's where you might put them on a grace period. We'll talk about that. But if it's one of those two categories, there's a code passed on that says non-resident alien with a tracking date. So if a student comes through today and they're eligible and everything looks good, but their visa expires February 1st, we're going to make that determination expire February 1st and put a flag of non-resident alien and a tracking date of February 1st so the campus is aware. So on the campus procedures, you need to find a way to review these things that get flagged. The other two, active duty military and non-resident North Carolina National Guard, again, which are very rare, these are not short-term things. I mean, a lot of colleges or universities, I think in practice, maybe review it once a year. Anyone admitted on that out-in active duty exception can keep that, even if the service member leaves, as long as they're still continuously enrolled in the same program. Once they finish that, or go to transfer, it's no longer applicable. Same thing with the North Carolina National Guard. That one, those contracts are long-term. I mean, typically you're talking about 6-8 years sometimes. So, I mean, we'll put the date in there, but, okay, honorable discharge. So yes, which I wanna, let me see if we can come back to that. Yes, the discharge has to be honorable, but again, that's more on the veteran side. We'll look at that. I mean, there are things about keeping it, but I'd rather come back if we have time. I want to hit a couple of the other things that are a little more common. When you get to those weird scenarios, but in general, even if there's been an honorable discharge, the student, if they're still enrolled, they can keep that out in. It's if they're trying to get it in, that becomes the less than honorable impacts veterans because that's one of the conditions. And again, VA will screen for that about, yes, they do. I mean, okay, but we're getting to a very, let me see if we can come back to that because that gets into these rare exceptions if they're trying to get the in, but if they're keeping the out in, they're okay keeping the out in. It's just, are they trying to get in to change the in and they just got discharged? So that's something RDS would handle because if you send them back, we'd look at that. Okay. All right. At the end of the manual, there are charts that go through all the exceptions. And here we go. You can actually eliminate that first one and tell you if it's something that needs to be tracked. Okay. UNC full scholarship, that's just UNC's, you know, so it's going to tell you like here for immigration. And in general, as I say, the grace period is not going to apply because most of these exceptions. For immigration, you can, okay, you can file a grace period for someone whose visa expires. So if they are attending, their visa expires, they haven't been renewed, you have a couple of options. You can either send them back to RDS to review if they have the documents. The campus can collect the document of a visa renewal if you want to be responsible for documenting that and keeping the new renewal date, okay? Because this is not an exception, it's just a time limit on the regular residency, a statutory period can be given. So if a student expires this month, you can put them on a grace period, which we're going to get to in a second, to give them a 12-month cushion. Okay. And then we have, hold on, sorry, I have a question I'll get to in a second. Statutory grace period. Okay, let me come back to that, but in a second here, but community college exceptions, you've really got to look at the particular document or what you need to track based on the individual exception, whether it's for 1 year, whether it's by semester, like the business certified, it's got to be for each semester. The business is paying directly versus the student who just graduated high school can have it for a year. Okay. The tuition waivers, again, it depends on what's required. So we'll come back to that. So I've had a couple of questions. Temporary protected status. Does that include DACA? No. Temporary protected status as used by immigration is a very specific category, all right, that has a temporary status. DACA, or people applying for asylum who have no status, are what they call, either withheld from, not deportation, but withheld from action. They're here at the discretion of immigration while their case is being decided. Temporary protected status is for limited countries for a limited period of time, based on presidential order, when there's usually been a natural disaster that's widespread, or civil war, political conflict. They will give them an easy path to get here and stay temporarily and either decide to return to that country or see if they can apply for another status here. It's typically given for 1 or 2 years and extended, but it's a limited number of countries. Those countries change, the eligibility changes. That's different. A DACA or a student who has applied for asylum or any other status, they're in a withholding from removable status. It's not the same as this category. Okay, so that's the difference. So no, it would not include those. Is the manual online? The guidebook is online. Okay. We also emailed them to everybody in the world, I think, but this campus guide is under that password protected section. Maybe Monty at the end, we can send them out again. Okay, this is an internal document. The other one's public, the RDS guidebook. This is not one we want to send out to students and everyone in the world. Okay. Let me see if any other questions. I think that was it so far. Statutory grace period. So the law provides, the most common example is if a student has been attending, they've been in state, okay? They tell you, my family just moved to Virginia, can I keep taking classes online? We don't live here anymore. There is a provision that the student can be put on a statutory grace period and keep that tuition rate for up to 12 months from the event. Meaning, if someone moved on July 1st of this year, and they just told you today would not be the start of the clock, it would have been July 1st. So, and this again can be applied to students who don't have their visa expired, okay? So it gives them a cushion there, but there's a process written in the guidebook to follow to notify RDS, so we can code it in there and watch it, but also they do lose their grant eligibility as of the date of the change, but they can keep the in-state tuition. There's another provision that's a little trickier that usually RDS has to deal with. If that student moves out of state and maybe they get there and say, oh, I thought I was going to have a good job or something, it didn't work out, I want to come back. If it's within 12 months, and they can show they've started changing things back, then they may be eligible to revert to that in-state without a loss there and not having to meet a new duration requirement. And again, this is all detailed in the book. and how to do that, and RDS will help coordinate and evaluate that. As long as they say change something back to North Carolina and are here now, within that 12 months, they wouldn't have to start over with that 12-month statutory period.
How does continuous enrollment play in this?
Okay, so continuous enrollment is going to automatically extend anyone who does not have an exception, because we're extending people who met the regular residency requirement. So those out-ins with the military, veterans, any exception you give is not going to get extended except for out of state. It's only going to extend your residency. In this case, Monty, they're basically, at that point of the change, they've become a non-resident, and RDS has to change that so that we're not violating any laws about the grants. So we would notify grants, but it will, you've given them, it's just, at that point, it's like they didn't qualify up front ever for in-state, but you can go ahead and let them have the 12 months. Does that help?
Yes.
So yeah, so anyone who has an out-in or out, those kind of things is not going to get passed, or has a visa or TPS status with immigration is not going to be sent to clearinghouse for those kinds of extensions. So again, it applies to residency determination. Can't be applied to any tuition exception. In other words, somewhat that high school student who had it for 1 year, or that business sponsored student who was being paid for 1 semester, there's no grace period to allow them to keep it for another year. Those are exceptions they already received. Tuition waivers, I'm just going to mention briefly, we sometimes get questioned about it. There's a general listing in the guidebook. Many or most of them require that the student be living in North Carolina. So certainly you can use the RDS determination for that. But if there are additional requirements, the campus is responsible. There's some that don't. For example, when I look at the statute about the seniors auditing classes, it doesn't mention anything about them having to be a North Carolina resident. But almost all of these other things do. There's, by the way, another one in the pipeline the legislature is considering for graduates of the North Carolina School of Science and Math, I believe. The question was what the exact wording will be at the end, whether it's just going to be for UNCs or UNCs and community colleges. So I'll let you know when that passes through the legislature, if it does. So again, you can use RDS to determine if they meet the residency portion, but that doesn't mean they automatically meet everything. There are 2 types of codes, and there's confusion about this, that RDS passes on to campuses. The first is a category code, what path they took coming through. So for example, the student who, most commonly you're going to see like eligible, meets duration or something like that, or for example, military, eligible military spouse. So that's the path they took, and you're going to see an out-end determination. A different set of codes that people often mix up the two is exception codes. And this is going to be either passing on information the student reported, self-reported, such as I'm a veteran, or I have a veteran's benefit, or like I'm a UNC system employee eligible for a waiver, whatever. We can't verify those or within the time frame, or if they still have a VA benefit. We're passing that on as informational. A couple of those categories I mentioned that need tracking, the long-term, the active duty and the North Carolina National Guard, but the immigration ones that need tracking will have a flag that says non-resident alien. If it doesn't have that, they're in a category like a green card that's permanent. I mean, green card holders, permanent residents, asylees, refugees, if we go into the immigration database and look up a student one-on-one, it's going to say they're all here indefinitely. We're looking at the ones that have a specific expiration date. So just in those cases, we would pass on that flag and a tracking date. So I hope that helps distinguish between those two, but it's really informational for the campus. If they're saying, oh, I'm a veteran and have a benefit, we're not saying they definitely do. You got to verify that, because we'd have no way of knowing, especially since these are good for, at least 15 months in most cases. We don't know if someone maybe has a benefit today, they're using it up this semester. Okay. So I think we're about the end. So we'll have this again, and Monty's gonna send this out with the resources, our contact numbers. In general, if your question is about, what's going on with the determination, helping the student, understanding why they just got out, you're probably your best bet is calling the campus line. If a student has questions, have them call the student line. They can help them go through the interview, answer questions. What do they need? What are the issues? This, by the way, Slides has that password for that protected thing, which would have this guidebook. But if it's a campus-based responsibility, that's something that probably I would help you with, and the system office help you with, or any policy or guidance. The folks at RDS really don't get into all the campus stuff. It's kind of beyond their scope. So they probably wouldn't have, they'd probably refer it to me. So this also tries to put that out there. So I know that's a lot of information. Let me see. Somebody's asked a question here. So the question is kind of distinguishing between and here's where we just have to go back and read very carefully, the non-US citizen public high school graduate. It doesn't, yes, that's correct. I don't believe it specifies it's right after your graduation. But the new one does for US citizens. When you have some of these, when we get to that level of, is it this or this? I'm happy if you give me a call, we'll puzzle through it together. Sometimes I have to pull out the statute again just to make sure I'm remembering it correctly. Is there eligibility for the exception for 1 year? It depends. Sarah was asking a question. Some of the exceptions are very time limited. Others are not. Some of them it's tied to one term and a benefit. Others are for a year. Some of them it is not limited. So each one you're going to have to go through. That's why I separated each one out in the guidebook to try to guide you through that. I know it's a lot. It's kind of confusing. So has to go back to the slide with the password. We're going to resend this, but we've sent this out several times with the other presentations and the guidebook and the campus manual, and sent it to the, yeah. Okay, so I get this question every year about DACA, and pretty much, Deanna, every year somebody introduces something about DACA, okay? It usually doesn't go anywhere, and it did not. So, I mean, at this point, I don't see a hope. The situation with DACA and why we have to take the position we do is, in federal law, if you look at U.S. Immigration's website, it says they don't have a status. They've registered, we're reviewing it, of what are we going to do with this category, but they're not entitled to anything because they don't have a non-immigrant status. They don't have an immigrant status. They don't have any status other than they've registered, they're allowed to work, as are people applying for asylum. So, however, they've said that if a state wants to pass something, giving a special provision, they can, but it has to be funded out of state funds. Last I checked, there were about 12 or 13 states that had limited things. Maybe if you graduated from high school, you could go to a public university or something like that, or there were time limits. North Carolina has not. And yeah, trust me, I follow all this. I mean, big part of my job is getting in every day and looking at, things there. But every time a bill's introduced, I get high school counselors, ringing off the hook about, oh, I heard there's, the legislature. No, they've introduced a bill, but yeah, it didn't even go to a first step. Unfortunately, I mean, it is what it is, and it's, if And in all of this, RDS isn't invested in one position or another. It's like whatever the law says, we have to kind of follow. But that's what's involved in that one. U.S. immigration is very clear that they're not eligible unless the state wants to give a provision. And, yes, pretty much every year something's introduced. It just hasn't advanced. Maybe someday, as I say, there's about 12 or 13 states last time I checked that will give a special provision. So that's it for me. Other questions? So the question is, the student who was lawfully admitted in the past, even if they don't have a status now, doesn't matter. Yes, that's correct. They could have had a visa that didn't meet the requirements and expired, or they could have one that did meet the requirements and expired. As long as they can show at some point, okay, any time, I think there's 3 cases in there where it talks about someone either U.S. citizen or lawfully admitted. If it says lawfully admitted, and again, if you read the guidebook, I go into more detail on the forms, is that yes, you can use that so long as at some point they did have a status and were admitted through the gate, even if it's not one we would take. So yes, a visitor visa, an F1 visa is generally not eligible, but I guess you could give it to them for a year based on that. Okay. And again, when you get into these, I know that's really complicated. And before RDS went live, I realized this was going to be a lot of stuff about immigration because it's remarkably complex. And I would say probably with RDS staff handling appeals, it's probably 40% of my consultation. So if you have one of those unusual cases, please feel free to let us know, and I'm happy to help you puzzle it out. Yes, the public high school graduate is limited to 1 year, and it's got to be the year following their graduation. At the end of that year, they lose eligibility. They would have to qualify another way. So as we're waiting see if there's other questions, certainly you can, there's one coming in, but, let us know, contact us. We have regular liaison calls. You can contact me. I'm happy to look at that. So a question just came in about North Carolina public high school graduates. Do they have to exhaust reconsideration appeal options? Okay. So no. To my mind, if you're talking to the student and hear their situation, if it sounds like there's any chance they could, they just, the 2 top issues of why students get out with RDS is either they keyed in the wrong name, social date of birth, which is a huge issue, even though we have them do it twice, or they just skip too many questions. There's nothing to validate. If you're working with a student and it sounds like they could qualify, you might have them go back. If it's one of those where they currently have no immigration status, there's not much RDS can do with that. And in that case, yeah, I don't see the need for them to keep coming back. So Emily, I hope that helps. No, in the exception, they don't. I just think that in general, if it were me, back in the days I was on a campus, if they could qualify, it'd probably be in their best interest to do it and possible grants, and also to minimize the work or tracking for a campus if an exception really wasn't the only path for them. So,
We made it.
We did. I'm okay if there's other questions. Otherwise, you can send them to me, and I apologize for that. And I know that's a lot of stuff to digest, but I would say, start with going to that campus guide for these kinds of issues, and it should answer most of your questions. You're always going to have these unusual ones that are not that many, but I'm happy to talk about them. It's not uncommon when we get unusual scenarios at RDS and a reconsideration appeal, you know, the staff will say, okay, can you help me sort this out? What eligibility is there? Is there any? What's, you know, what's going on, or what do I need?
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
I hope this was helpful. You know, let me know, or if you have any suggestions for future releases of this manual to make it more helpful to you. It's meant to be a good tool. You know, let me know, and I'm happy to discuss them with you and see what we can do to make your job a little easier.
Well, Gene, thank you for the presentation today. It was very helpful.
Thank you.
And Community College family, thank you for taking your time to be on this call today. I will give you the rest of your day back, and I will send the recordings out to you once we get them converted to YouTube. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm stopping recording now.
Thank you, everyone.